Welcome to another episode of the Silmarillion Sessions. I'm Dr. Mikael Thompson and co-host William Lasseter here. And today we're going to continue the account of the beginning of days. One of the interesting things about the last episode was we saw the creation of light, the separation from light from the darkness, and the two great towers, the two great lamps that were set upon these massive pillars higher than the mountains, and how Melkor cast them down. But an interesting thing is that they shone simultaneously at either end of the world. And so the whole world was illuminated consistently and constantly by those two lamps. And they were cast down, and that was not yet the beginning of days. There was this initial light, and then they enter into another phase of darkness. But today, we'll see the beginning of days, the actual shift of day and night, which marks the beginning of the count of time. And that, I think, is actually a great topic to perhaps start with, before we introduce how they, what is the second attempt to create sources of light, the creation of the trees, as most of you are familiar with. I think it's a good place to actually start a conversation before that, to orient ourselves. What is going on here? Why create, why make an accounting of multiple? We'll ultimately see this isn't the last attempt to create lights. As you notice, most of the world today is not governed by the light of two trees. Something obviously has gone wrong with that, and there's been planned 3 or 4 or 5. But why have these multiple attempts at creating light? Why is it significant towards building light and darkness to creation of time? If time really kind of begins, or the counting of time begins with the creation of the trees, what was going on before that then? Why time? What's with time? The creation of days, beginning of days, rather. What is that all about? Why do we care about that?
Can I jump in?
Yes, please.
Okay, so there are 2 things that come to mind. The first thing that comes to mind is, you notice in our opening, fans of this program, Dan Haynes' brilliant depiction of the Valinors, which is based on the style of Byzantine icons. And Byzantine icons are frequently critiqued by Westerners who want realism, who say, look, they got this gold background, and I don't get into that because there's no gold background in real life. And what they're missing is that's the point, that in an icon, in a Russian or Greek Orthodox icon, the gold background represents the eternal now of heaven, of the other world. And it's supposed to parallel a world that has perpetual light. And that's kind of what we're seeing when we see those 2 lanterns at either side of the world. Mm. I had pointed out originally that I think Tolkien was thinking about the 2 circles connected to each other that create the Vesca Piscis, and that the world itself was that within that. And so you had the 2 lamps on either side. And I think that's what he was thinking about. So that whole representation of the 2 lamps and the eternal now and the gold background in the Byzantine icons is of a piece. So that's on the one hand. But your second question, the eternal now, moving to time. First off, I can't help but think that the whole thrust of this work, if you connect it especially with the next 2 works of Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, the whole thrust of this work is towards an age of men, of humans. Even at the end of Lord of the Rings, when the elves are all passing into the West, he indicates that the world is moving towards a world of men. Mm-hmm. And if that's the case, human beings, as you mentioned, have that special gift of Iluvatar, which is death. Human beings experience time. And time, it seems, is part of that gift. It's not just that there's an eternal now where none of our choices make any difference, or where we are trapped in bad choices and cannot fix them because they become permanent in that sort of eternity. It's rather that every new day allows for change, alteration, fixing things, or making it worse if you're in that if you get into that, buddy. But every day is another possibility. As Fulton Sheen, the great Fulton Sheen, used to say, some people wake up and they say, "Oh God, another day," and some people wake up and say, "Oh God, another day." Every day allows for that opportunity, and time itself becomes a healer of wounds and becomes a healer of hurts and becomes an opportunity to change who you were in the past and become someone else. One of the things we will notice about the elves, I think, is that they make choices and they get stuck in those choices. They cannot change. They cannot get out of them. And one of the big differences we see in Lord of the Rings, and I think it's absolutely brilliant, it's moving as hell, is that human beings can make terrible choices and then repent. And Boromir, like, for instance, is my favorite on this. I mean, Boromir, if you haven't read Lord of the Rings, where have you been living? Boromir makes a really bad choice at one point. He tries to take the ring from Frodo, and he then has to go and protect the two other hobbits, and he dies doing so. And his last words to Aragorn are, "I tried to take the ring. I'm sorry for it. I have paid the price." And he dies, and Aragorn says, "You go in peace," because he actually repents at the last minute.
In many ways, he's redeemed himself through the shedding of his blood to save. He's really laid down his life now to save the two hobbits, where moments before he was willing to take the life of Frodo in order to grasp the ring.
But because of time and his sense of time, he realized that mistake and was able to repent of it, even in the small bit of time that he had. I think that the example we are going to see with elves on a regular basis anyway, there are some exceptions, they make a choice, and that choice changes them permanently. They do not get out of that choice.
Or at least even for those who do change course, it's very, very, very long time.
Yes.
Thousands of years. Often things continue to go worse. But it can be 1,000 or more years before there's really that. Actually, it's an interesting point. It's something I hadn't thought about before, because even with Galadriel, who we'll see participates in some bad things, we understand her song. The last time we see her, well, not the last time we see her in the Lord of the Rings, but as the company is leaving Lothlorien, what is it? Lothlorien, as they're leaving Lothlorien, she's singing this song. What ship could bear me back across so vast a sea? She's under the bed. She's not. She departed, and we'll see all this in subsequent episodes. She participated in bad thing, was sort of exiled, chose to not repent, not with them, because they, as you said, they've committed themselves to a course of action, to a certain path, and they followed down that out of really a perduring pride, even if she didn't. She doesn't have bloody hands herself, but there's this deep pride, this arrogance, this really a pride, a wanting to have her own dominion, and has worked very hard for that. She's made a whole career out of this for ages upon ages, and she's not allowed to come back. Right? Anybody who leaves now, said the Valar tell these group of Noldor, anybody who leaves, you're not allowed back. That's it, closed door, and she's part of that group. And she's part of that group. Now we see a beautiful thing after the ring is destroyed. She's allowed to come back. We see her and Gandalf and Frodo and Big Bilbo. They all depart together on the ships of the Grey Havens to come across to the Isles of the Blessed. And they are allowed back. She's allowed back, but it's really by an exceptional grace. And in many ways, it's the closest thing we could say, perhaps, to repentance and not merely regret, was her gentle refusal of Frodo offering her the ring. She passed the test, as she says, right? And so that's interesting. I hadn't thought about that before, but it's so stirring, and it's so singular in that it's singular. We don't really see elves do that often.
No.
Or at least it's just not common. It's not common. That's a very good point. I had not thought about that before.
And what we
see, they don't have the possibility of repentance, strictly speaking, but their sense of time is very different, and so they can't it's above their nature to be able to about face so quickly. And we'll see the ramifications of that, the choices of one thing leading to another throughout the rest of the Silmarillion.
Yes, and Galadriel is a great example of that. She has that wonderful line, that where she realizes what would happen if her pride actually found its desire, and she says, "I will fade into the west and remain Galadriel. That's what it's going to happen. I'm going to go back to the west, and people will forget about me, and I'm okay with it." So, in other words, she would not have had that had there been no time for her to be able to figure it out and repent. And part of what the beauty of this work here is it gives you that background that makes that singular point in the Lord of the Rings that much more powerful, that much more potent. Because you're not looking at just some woman who just happens to be walking through the woods and decides not to take the ring. You're looking at the culmination of thousands of years for her of time of agonizing over this issue. The other
ambition.
And an ambition. The other example is Arwen. I think Arwen Evenstar. Because when she eventually decides to stay with Aragorn, she recognizes she's entering into time much more so than she was before. And she accepts that agony. She accepts that agony. The eventual seeing of Aragorn grow old and die, and even though she's warned against it, she chooses it. She chooses to become part of time more than she was before.
It
raises a really interesting issue for me, this whole question of time, because our perception of time is all, they've discovered now, physicists have discovered now that time does not remain constant throughout the universe. It does shift. And in many ways, time is only a perception. That it's all here or the liver or whatever we located in. It's all part of our perception of things. So we perceive time in different modes according to different things that are happening in different moods, whatever. There used to be that there was chronological time and chairotic time. Chronological time was just the incessant day after day after day, and chairotic time was party time, and it went like that, like summer vacation for a student, So time itself, we perceive it differently. But there are people that don't have a sense of time itself passing by. And what's odd about that is that they frequently don't value the people and things around them that should be valued. Coming into a sense of time means that you also come into a sense of valuing things because they're passing. There's a great line from Shakespeare, right? That time of me thou mayst, and me beholds when yellow leaves are none or few to hang. Bare ruined choirs that shake against the cold where late the sweet birds sang.
It's been a long time.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
It's been a long time since I've heard that.
And he has at the end of that, he says, you must love that thing which you must leave ere long. Right. So time is intimately connected in Tolkien to that blessing of Iluvatar, which is death. Right. If we were in an eternity of never changing, our choices would be permanent. This is one of the reasons why the choice that Lucifer makes is permanent. Lucifer is never going to be reconciled, right? There's never going to be a point where he's like, darn it, I made a mistake. At least not that we know of, I guess. Maybe there are some philosophers who think otherwise, or theologians. In this case, Melkor, he made that decision, even from the very beginning of things, before there was time. And it's permanent. He is the darkness. Right? So time, very important.
Yeah, and we see that and we saw we see in previous pages here that some of the, and we'll see more, some of the Maiar and various other spiritual beings can still fall away, and they do, right, to follow after Melkor during at least up until this point, which is an interesting prospect. One we often don't think about is that if the elves live in a different sense of time than men do, the Valar and Maiar live in a different kind of time again, but insofar as they've entered into Ea, into the cosmos, they do exist in a kind of time, but it's in a very different thing. But it's I think what I'm seeing in the text then from what you're saying, Mr. Lasseter, is the reminder that this is myth, and as myth, it's about more than just the narrative of the text. And so this division of, we'll talk about here imminently, the creation of the trees that emanate light in alternation, and thus we have a sequence of time, which is there's an alternation of things. Got an alternator, now the thing can move. We can have time. But the before that, it was just the light, is not merely chronologically, this happened and then that happens, but rather that we're circling around an idea at different levels of existence, at different sort of planes of reality. And so on the one hand, with those two pillars, as you said, there's the Vesica Pisces, there's the overlapping circles, and they're saying something about sort of the anatomy of creation. There's also a sense of, kind of a sense of staticness to it. There was a conflict, and and then the Valar made a strategic retreat behind these great mountains and built their little paradise, and it sits, and everything, there's no real plot movement. Things just kind of stay. And there's light and there's darkness, but they're more physical realities and temporal realities. And then, as we'll see with the creation of the trees, then the mind of the Valar starts to turn towards, hey, there's a future. The elves and men are going to come into this world at some point. We better be prepared. We got to go clean things up a bit, drive Melkor out. When they left, everything else in the world outside of their nice little kingdom of Valinor, is inhabited by monsters and darkness, and Morgoth kind of just goes strolling about every once in a while. They say, well, that's no place for these new elves and men to be born into. We better go eventually turn our minds to do that and to the fight that needs to be fought. But that only in the story really becomes precipitated with this beginning of the counting of time, the beginning of days.
Yeah, and what you brought up there is kind of interesting because Tolkien was living during an era, the mid-20th century, where there was a great deal of critical theory going on about the nature of writing and the nature of art in general. And frequently you'd have novels and things that broke that fourth wall and talked to the audience, or that tried to, you had James Joyce, for instance, was writing the little sporadic works that that dealt with time in a weird way, and you had others that would create works that were cyclic, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I wonder if he wasn't thinking about that too, because in a work of music, right? A work of music unfolds in time. That is, you hear it in time, but on the page, it's static, right? A work of literature unfolds in time, but on the page, it's static. This is already a complete thing. And I could say from here to here, it's already there. But I discover it, or I learn about it over a period of time. So time itself is involved in these works, music and this, unlike, say, for instance, a painting or a sculpture, which you don't experience in the same way. So I wonder if Tolkien wasn't to some degree dealing with that to try and recreate a sense of a timelessness entering into time, using a text that itself had to unfold in time. Do you know what I'm saying? It's something which I frequently hear from people that read the Silmarillion. They say, well, it doesn't go anywhere. I know, it doesn't go anywhere. That's the point. Is first, until you get into time, there is no real plot. It's just, that's just sort of like looking at an angle.
Yeah, that's a good point. Where you look over here, look over here. It's like you're examining a painting until you get these beings that are really in time, the elves and then man, that we start to move things, and then it starts to actually move along. They're not necessarily with a modern sense of time, modern materialist sense of time, which is something to address later on. Yeah, that's really interesting to me. Although and there's something I just want to, it occurs to me, I don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole, but to spark ideas for fruit of later conversation. The idea of a text is something that you only experience in time. There's the paper, the text on the paper is static and is only geographical, it's only spatial. But in reading a text, there's not just the story on the page, the story only happens in the space between the reader and the paper upon which the thing's printed, right? So there's other thing that happens, and which means my experience of a text is predicated actually in many ways on the physicality of it.
Yeah.
And turning pages, and I was just thinking, so here's an interesting idea. Turning pages is a different kind of phenomenon than scrolling through a thing. And so the invention of the codex, I would pause it, and I'm sure I'm not the first to do this. And then there's the invention of the codex. You've got a very different notion of time, subtly different, perhaps at first, than the scrolling of a scroll, the rolling of a scroll, which reads top to bottom as you go along. It's a continuous cycle versus this discrete page breaks, which is similar. Then again, when we scroll on something like this, we can do a continuous scroll. It involves a very different sense of time, which is why time seems to pass differently when you're doing this than when you're flipping pages. But it's not only these. There are other kinds of things that stuff has been written on, right? So these styles in the ancient Near East with things written spirally down the pillar, or lengthwise along these pillars in Celtic lands in Northern Europe, or many other things besides. Maybe not least of which is also the insides of caves deep in the ground. What is the experience of time, the significance of time with these things? That should just get our noodles baking.
Really yeah, because of course our technology forms us just as much as we form our technology. I mean, I was really fascinated. A friend of mine, Lydia Eby, who's not married, but anyway, she pointed out the ancient samurai in Japan, they used to have kanji, letters, text, written all over their armor. Okay. And the kanji also was coupled with little pictures, little images all over their armor as kind of like a ward, or it wasn't just like attach here, or do not step on this or something. It wasn't that. It was
made over in China.
Yeah, right, exactly. Pennzoil. No, it was little stories that were written, battle stories all over the kanji. So she pointed out that in later iterations, Japan became the leader in manga, in illustrated story, in a comic book form, little squares with images and some words in it. Manga is a direct evolutionary art form from the kanji that was written all over the samurai warrior stuff. That was fascinating to me, because what it meant was that the whole technology that they were using, which is the manner of writing and the little pictures and the little coupling with words, evolved into thinking about the world a certain way and creating artwork a certain way, which is the manga, which existed as far back as I understand it, as far back as pre-World War II. They were writing before even the guys at DC and Marvel were creating their comic books.
Right, so that's true.
Any of our art, any of our modes of delivering the message are going to have an effect on how we think about the world around us, which is another cautionary tale for whether we want to think about the world as confined by a little tiny box or not. I don't know. We should read.
Yes. So, the beginning of days is caused by the following. So, when the Valar, and it's not mentioned explicitly, but at a close reading of the text, is a technical term, and even in Italian, the literary theorists in Italian refer to un close reading del testo, whatever. When you actually pay attention to what you're doing, as best as I can tell, that's what it means. Just pay attention to what you're doing.
Yeah.
He doesn't have to say it, but the lanterns just got spilled and incinerated the whole earth, which means it's pretty dark. Okay. The Valar have hidden now beyond the mountains in this gate, beyond this gate, and they have their little life. And whenever they burned, by the way, Yavanna, who gave birth to all these trees and these plants and giant mushrooms and whatever all else, that's all dead. Everything she sang into being is gone. We didn't get a sense of that devastation until here. When Valinor was full wrought, the mansions of the Valar were established. In the midst of the plain beyond the mountains, they built their city, Valmar, of many bells. Before its western gate, there was a green mound, Edzalohar, that is also named Corolaire, and Yavanna hallowed it, And she sat there long upon the green grass and sang a song of power, in which was set all her thought of things that grow in the earth. But Nienna thought in silence, so she did not sing, and watered the mold with her tears. So she watered the ground, the humus on the ground. She watered with her tears. So the mingling of Yavanna's song into the earth and Nienna's tears watering the earth causes something to happen. Now all the Valar gather together to hear the song of Yavanna, and they sat upon their thrones. And as they watched, upon the mold there came forth, and I'm just passing over certain things here. There came upon the mold, from the mold, there came forth two slender shoots, and silence was over all the world in that hour. Nor was there any sound save the chanting of Yavanna. Under her song the saplings grew and became fair and tall and came to flower, and thus there awoke in the world the two trees of Valinor. Of all the things which Yavanna made, they have the most renown, and about their fate all the tales of the elder days are woven. So everything that we, the elves, because that's who produced this text, everything we know, all of our text, all of our history is bound up, all of our present is bound up with the fate of these two trees. That's what everything's about, the life, the universe, and everything.
Yes. Yes.
It's about these two trees. They describe the trees, which I think is worth going into in a moment, but essentially for those who don't know, who've been living on the other side of the mountain under Morgoth's darkness all this time, never read anything else about anything from Middle-earth, just to fill you in, the two trees produce light. One is a little more silver and the other is a little more golden, and they produce light in alteration, so that there's a twilight or a dawn in between the fading of the one and the growing light of the other, where the gold and the silver intermingle. And that light from these two trees plays a significant role in everything that follows, even through the the Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings, through various persons, through various artifacts, and through various events. This is really the central theme of these two trees. That's really cool.
It is cool. I always thought, wouldn't it be neat to have a nightlight that was in the shape of these two trees and that went from sort of a gold light to a silver light back? That'd be so cool. I love that. I don't know. Somebody probably sells it on Amazon. I don't know. just a slow glow.
Somebody made in Belarus.
Somebody made it, I'm sure. This is really interesting to me too. I mean, it was well known that Tolkien loved trees and that he walked in forests around his neighborhood and all this. He called the tearing up of trees orc work. But most of the time it's like, oh, that's quaint. He liked trees, or he was like a proto tree hugger or whatever. No, he wasn't really. That's not where he would have gone. Tolkien understood that on the one hand, trees, especially around his territory, were very, very old. You look at some of these trees, like these sequoias, for instance. Yeah. These damn things, they would have been around way before Rome was founded. Some of them, go as far back as the Egyptian Empire.
There are trees in, I don't know if it's officially in California or Nevada, but along that border zone, there are some famous coniferous trees. They're living windswept, rocky landscape that are as old as Abraham.
Yeah.
Right, that go way, way back.
Way back. And you look at things like the petrified forest, for instance, which, those trees were huge. They were like the conifers, but they're even older than that. They were around way back when these huge catastrophic events occurred. So what do you do with that? These trees would have seen a lot. They would have understood a lot. If there's any tree soul or any kind of tree consciousness, if you could talk to a tree and it would tell you, yeah, I was around back when the asteroid hit and wiped out the dinosaurs. That would be a trip. I mean, that'd be amazing. And it's also interesting.
Right.
Life comes back after each winter. Here in Minnesota, our winters are bodacious. We got a heck of a lot of snowfall and really cold weather. Not as much as, say, California passes, which got an amazing amount. but then it goes away, and lo and behold, things come back again, right? They sprout up again. Life returns to the planet. So trees, in some ways, represent this life force that comes back even after great devastation, even after the fires that have been created by Melkor and the destruction of the
Right.
whole landscape. These trees, they still come back. But these ones come back, and I find this really interesting. They come back through a divine song and through divine tears. Because there's a sorrow that is involved. If you could talk to trees, there is a sorrow that is involved in being able to sit and look at the world and not be able to stop what's happening around you.
It's the tragedy of the Ents and the Entwives disappearing
Yeah.
is recounted in Lord of the Rings. It's another meditation on that same thing.
And what happened to those Zen wives?
There's a lighter version and a really dark version. I don't like thinking about the latter, but I've got little theories. But these two trees are born, and these two trees also then. So there's two modes of that continuity. So just to actually latch more to graft on to that theme of continuity that you said, the amazing thing about trees in a northern country is that, like England or Minnesota, is that the leaves all fall, and where everything else dies essentially and grows anew, even if it's growing from its own roots, it dies and grows anew from the ground in spring. The trees still alive. They don't die in the winter, they just go dormant. And it's that way, right? They really are a symbol of hope and life perduring through the darkness, through the winter. And even these two trees, they live on. They'll get destroyed, right? We know that that's going to happen. Because the time that the text is produced, that already has happened, right? Clearly, just like you and I know, there aren't two luminous trees, illuminating the world right now.
Right.
They get destroyed, but their light perdures through other sources, but also their generation continues. In Elvenhome, which is a seed of that is then taken, or a sapling from that, a cutting from that is rooted and taken into Numenor, and a cutting from that, or fruit from that, is then taken just before Numenor is destroyed and makes its way to Gondor. And then you've got the fruit of, when Aragorn plants the new sapling, those are direct line descendants from these first primeval trees that created days.
Yeah. So this tree,
Right there.
that's basically a descendant from these trees that were created by Yavanna and Nienna.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. From the very beginning, which means then Aragorn's banner is a divine device, right? It's a symbol of this new life coming after that heralds the vanquishing of Morgoth himself. And trees to say to the kings and who was crownless, the crownless shall again be king, kind of theme in Tolkien's work, is that the oak trees, right? The oak trees, these massive ancient oak trees like you see in the southern states in North America, some of these massive oak trees like you see in England and in France. These things had seen, if not thousands and thousands of years, centuries of local history. That the idea of these, and it's certainly woven into English lore, is that this tree is the tree that my king once found refuge inside to escape persecution and murder.
This tree,
and
this tree is the tree where they hanged all these guys that were rebelling against the king at the same time that they were signing a Magna Carta.
Right, and this is a thing that's there. And there is of course what is it? It's not, I suppose, between a tree and a bush, what was planted by Joseph of Arimathea around some holy well in England. Some of the Roundheads came and they tore it all out, but somebody had taken a cutting. And so this is something that's woven into our own history, and we have a sensibility to that. So Tolkien's not just like a tree nut. He's saying there's something really significant in human, and it's not unique to England. We see this elsewhere. We're talking about England because that's where Tolkien lived. There is something universal about the continuity of a tree, the symbolism of a tree. Of course, we find in many cultures, around the same general idea, and it's this is my train of thought, but the oh, that's right. If a tree has a soul,
Yeah.
which of course, unavowed, it does. It
Yes.
has a soul. It's alive. That's what it means to have a soul, is to be alive. What we spent so much time on is in the early episodes of this series about the living cosmos, things having a life and spirit, is that the trees do have a spirit. A tree has a spirit, just like a rock has a spirit. Maybe a tree has something higher level of spirit than a rock, and lower than a human, maybe. But something like that, that there is something living in a tree that, at least with this different worldview, this different mindset, that there is something to a consciousness of the tree that can recount its stories to you if you only know how to listen.
Yeah.
If you
Yes.
only know how to slow down enough to understand the speech of the tree.
Yes. That's a really neat way to look at it. Two questions come up immediately. One is, what is it about the return of life every spring and life in general, trees, gardens, whatever, that brings so much joy, especially to anybody that suffers from seasonal depression? What is it about that? I mean, they're trees. I'm human. What do I have in common with these things? I mean, is there anything that I can point to that says why I rejoice when daffodils start springing up and the narcissus is coming up after a long winter? I mean, what is up with that? That's one thing. And the other question is then, how does this relate to this whole machine thing that we've talked about too? Because I can't think of any machine that I can look at that then I say, oh, that brings joy to my heart. That machine does. Very rarely. I mean, maybe a car or something, especially like a Stutz Bearcat.
Deep rumbling. That.
Most of the time, I'm not looking at my microwave, being like, now I have hope, or
Right.
or what have you.
Yeah. Open up your computer. After it reloads,
Oh,
it's a
thanks,
new update.
Microsoft.
Once again, it just doesn't have the same
It's not the same. It's not the same.
thing. It's not the same.
I think that
Not the same.
one thing I could.
In fact, I mean, just an observation. When a machine starts up again on its own, if you're walking by and a car engine revs, or your printer starts in the middle of the night, or your computer lights up without prompting, we tend to be more freaked out by this. So that's,
I'm sorry,
rather
I
than
can't do that,
comforting,
Commander Bowman.
yeah, right? It's unnerving when the machine starts behaving, starts coming to life on its own,
Yeah,
in a way that's not unnerving when a daffodil springs up
I
from the
know.
ground on its own.
I know. Yeah. You can see a light suddenly turns on in the house, and you didn't plan it. You're thinking ghosts or something.
Right.
You don't think that when a tree sprouts as a tulip flower or whatever.
Yeah.
And one thing I think of with this whole disaster thing, this whole catastrophe thing that we have pointed out before, if a catastrophe occurs on the Earth, very little of our machine civilization will survive. It just
Yeah.
won't, especially over thousands or millions of years. But startlingly, some of these plants have survived a catastrophe and have
Right.
survived for thousands or millions of
Absolutely.
years in more or less the same form. Ferns that we see in our gardens, those are the descendants of the same ferns that were around when the Brachiosaurus tread the earth. When the Allosaurus or the T-Rex was
Right.
hunting. They are the same beings, if you will. That's a really stunning idea. Now, by the way, just
Especially
for
when
a
you
caveat,
consider, yeah,
as a caveat, I'm not saying, for instance, that there was human civilization around with a Brachiosaurus. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that if we do rely on the machine world for our joy and our hope, it's not going to last. It just isn't. But this life stuff
right.
does, surprisingly. So,
Yeah, there's a tenacity to woody life.
yeah,
Life in wood. There's a tenacity
absolutely.
to it
Yeah.
that keeps coming back, and you can see that really, really compellingly in the countryside here in Italy. These olive trees, which are hundreds of years old, some 8,000 years old, and it's just this wooden shell. It looks like it should just be a dead stump, but it's a living thing, and there's branches coming off, and you prune the branches and the thing slowly grows and it's as if you had a multi-century like time-lapse photography filming of this. You'd see the things kind of grow up as a sprout, and then this undulating wood just grow wider over time, develop holes, and still produces fruit that can be pressed for oil.
Yeah.
And it's been harvested by the same by many different peoples, century over century over century. There's a very powerful sense of continuity there, and hope. And hope.
Yeah, continuity going as far back as the gods. Pretty far back.
Right.
So, description of those trees.
So, description of those trees. So there's two trees. The one had dark green, had leaves of dark green that beneath were shining as silver. And from each of his countless flowers, a dew of silver light was ever falling, and the earth beneath was dappled in the shadows of his fluttering leaves. The other bore leaves of a young green, like the new opened beech. Their edges were of glittering gold. Flowers swung upon her branches in clusters of yellow flame, formed each to a glowing horn that spilled a golden rain upon the ground. And from the blossom of that tree there came forth warmth and a great light. Telperion, the one was called in Valinor, and Silpion, and Ninquelotie, and many other names besides. But Laurelin the other was, and Malinalda, and Kulurien, and many other names in song beside. Now in 7 hours, the glory of each tree waxed to the full and waned again to naught. And each awoke once more to life an hour before the other ceased to shine. Thus in Valinor, twice every day there came a gentle hour of softer light, when both trees in Valinor both trees in Valinor were faint, and their gold and silver beams were intermingled. Telperion was the elder of the trees, and came first to full stature and to bloom. And that first hour in which he shone, the white glimmer of a silver dawn, the Valar reckoned not into the tale of hours, but they called it the opening hour, and counted from it the ages of their reign in Valinor. Therefore, from the 6th hour of the first day, not the first period of the first day, but the 6th hour of the first day, when the golden light started to shine, and all the joyful days thereafter, until the darkening of Valinor, which we will see again, Telperion ceased his time of flower. And at the 12th hour, Laurelin, her blossoming. And each day of the Valar in Aman contained 12 hours, and ended with the second mingling of the lights, in which Laurelin was waning, but Telperion was waxing. And it goes on to describe that how the light from each of the trees dripped, and it's not just a metaphorical description, a poetical description, the light dripped from their leaves. We're told that literally light came and gathered into huge shining lakes of light, liquid light that illuminated the whole land of the Valar. It had these wells of water and of light. And thus began the beginning of the bliss of Valinor, and thus began also the count of time.
Yeah. And I wonder, this speculation, do you think if we go forward in time to the mirror of Galadriel, and it's described there that the water that she uses is like, it's not quite water, it's shining. Do you think that's this here?
Yes, I do. I do on multiple counts. Because we'll see in her own birth, the light of the two trees is actually captured in her hair. And her hair shines that light, which is, again, part of why is this such a precious gift to Gimli? These 3 strands of her hair, because that is in fact the self-same light of these trees.
Wow.
Which we'll also see play into the Silmarils, which is a big deal, which is why it's a really, really big, why all the elves are shocked and scandalized that Gimli asks this. Okay? It's also not the first time it's been asked, but we'll get there. Or first time it's been desired. But on that count, but the light from Galadriel's mirror, right, which she then gathers into a vessel, whatever Frodo then carries around, right? So this kind of thing. The light, her mirror is illuminated by the light of the star Earendil. Earendil is a star that's luminous because it contains a Silmaril. It contains a Silmaril because he has it bound upon his brow or upon his ship, depending on the version of the myth, as he sails across the skies at night. And so that's the light of the Star of Eärendil, the light of one of the Silmarils, a divinized Silmaril. And the Silmarils contain the light from these trees. So very directly, yes, it is in fact that selfsame liquid light, if perhaps diluted through time.
So in a way, you could look at this work, the Silmarillion, as a work about time. It's a work about light coalesced in time itself. Anyway, that's really interesting. That's
Exactly
really
right.
Yeah, we don't think about light as a thing because we're so immersed in it all the time from the sun. You know,
Yeah.
we don't think of it as a thing, but there's this constant discussion in physics circles about whether light is a wave or a ray or whether it's both, and whether light itself is a substance. It's kind of fascinating. It's fascinating the way Tolkien takes it, and he says, "Yeah, let's just cut to the chase. It's a substance, and here it is, and it drips in some instances." But there are moments. I mean, honestly, there are moments, twilight, for instance, or sunrise, or what have you, or even midday, where you're like, you can be overtaken by this sudden realization of what light is and how light works. I mean, great painters were very aware of this. Light can be a thing that really, I don't know, it changes your perception of the world.
It does. And the light shining in Rome is different from the light shining in Paris. Even though it's
Yes.
the same sun,
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
light is different.
Yeah.
And any painter will tell you that.
Yep. Yeah. Who's the great painter from the north? Is it Van Eyck who does all those wonderful, like the girl opening the window and all this? And
Yeah.
I forget who it was, but just these amazing pictures of light there in those northern countries in the Netherlands, or Caravaggio with his shadows and lights. It's just wow. It's hard to say light doesn't affect you when you start looking at it in that way. Let me point to something else really quick though. These two trees, they are male and female, and the two different. I forget which one it is. Telperion is the male, and Laurelin is the female. Okay, Telperion is the male, and Laurelin is the female. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Just to
Right.
point out,
Telperion is like the moonlight, and Laurelin is like the sunlight.
okay,
Sun being feminine, moon being masculine in
so the sun is
his
feminine.
linguistic framework.
Sun is feminine. That's interesting. Yeah.
For Tolkien, the sun is feminine. In the Germanic tongues, the sun is
Yes.
feminine, the moon is masculine.
Yes, that's just
But the sun and the moon are derivative of these two lights. So these two trees are the primitive of which our sun and moon are derived.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to point out that he's also
But you were saying, yes.
he's just drawing from a tradition, like you mentioned, the Norse tradition, for instance. And I will admit I had to look this up real quick on Wikipedia, but at the very beginning of the Norse mythology, there was the creation of man and woman, but they were created by creating trees, Ask and Embla first. And Ask, I think Ask is the ash tree, and Embla is the elm tree. So you got an ash and an elm tree that then are changed into human beings. So humans emerged from trees in Norse mythology.
So in Norse mythology, we actually we do have kinship with the tree.
Yes.
We are in fact descended from the same.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, I speculated with my brother the other day. It's just kind of an interesting speculation. If, for instance, we take for a minute that the evolutionary tree is a reality, and the man comes from the monkey or whatever. You go way, 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 way back. Is there a point where plant life and biological, or whatever you call it, mammalian or lizard life,
animal
life, they're one and the same? Is there a point there? I just find that interesting.
Yeah.
Or was it always zytoplankton and phytoplankton or whatever? I find it fascinating.
Evolves out of another, right? I mean, that's.
Well, I mean, what
even there, that symbolism, that imagery is still there.
Yeah.
In this, it's very interesting.
I mean, in Norse mythology, of course, they weren't thinking that, but they were certainly thinking that the qualities of these trees, the ash tree and the elm tree, they have a masculine or feminine quality to them. The ash, if I'm not mistaken, the ash is a smooth bark tree. Is that right? And they have they have
Smoother than a,
smoother bark. Anyway, it's just interesting. It's a smoother bark, and it almost has like
yes,
qualities that are more
than an
feminine.
elm.
So
And elms get like this. Elms get bushy.
yeah,
Elms get hairy. Elms
yeah.
dangle, especially in the springtime when the elms, whatever they're called, elm trees, when their leaves, they're hairier. They
Hmm,
have like facial hair. You can tell it almost has the appearance of having a beard,
interesting.
being more hirsute in general. Whereas an ash tree reaches up and flows more gracefully. Yeah.
Uh, well, I mean, it's interesting to me. It's interesting that they would have thought of the trees as being masculine and feminine, and so human beings emerging from those have qualities similar to those trees. Again, going back to that whole like the first creation being trees rather than human beings. I mean, even at the end of
Right.
their world after Ragnarok, there's a man and woman that survive.
Hmm.
Um, Leaf and Leafrasier, I think. Is that right? Leafrasier? Yeah.
So
Leaf and
again, tied to
Leafrasier.
trees being named after leaves.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Yeah,
In
similar
fact,
thing,
which
Um,
is interesting because also then in Hebrew and Christian um, Genesis, right? So the creation accounts, trees are also bound up with man's. I mean, really bound up with man's fate. Man's fate is bound up with trees from
yeah,
beginning to
sure.
end.
Sure.
But even in the beginning, there's trees, and then man's placed in the garden around the tree. Now, man and woman don't come independently from a tree, but they're drawn from the same sort of primal source of humanness, formed out of the ground directly
Yeah,
by
yeah,
Yahweh, but under the shadow of a tree, with
right.
two particular trees of reference: the tree of knowledge and the tree of life.
Mm-hmm.
And these two act in concert in a not in a similar way, but we got the theme again of two trees and humanity springing forth from beneath the trees, and then they use leaves to cover themselves,
Yeah.
and then eventually they're given garments of skin. But then there's this whole, and this is an interesting thing that's wound up again with medieval North European Christian mythology, let's call it legend, story, is that, and Syriac, because there is actually a connection there between the ancient Near Eastern Christians and the North European, so in British Isles and Scandinavian Christianity, um, have this story, these stories, these legends, that there were seeds from the Garden of Eden. The tree was bits of the tree, a cutting from the tree was taken from the Garden of Eden in some way, propagated. There's various versions of this. A tree becomes propagated um, down the lines all the way. So you've got the tree of life. Literally, is there is a scion, a cutting that has been grafted, cutting that's been rooted, cutting that's been rooted from the original tree of life that grows then near Jerusalem, which is cut down to form the cross, which is the source of the lumber made for the cross that Jesus is crucified on. And similarly, we see, and so in the Arthurian legends, we also see this woven in, right? This kind of surfaces in different places, and they'll make reference to it. That you've got this actual continuity from a tree from the Garden of Eden figures in different significant events in salvation history,
Wow.
and is prophesied to figure forward into major events in salvation future, if we can call it that, right, towards the eschaton. That the wood of the cross is the wood of the tree of life. It's not merely an analogical symbolism, but in these traditions, and I'm sure there are others besides, but in these two traditions, in the Syriac, Semitic Christian tradition, and the North European, Germanic, Anglo-Scandinavian Christian tradition, there's this idea, there's this running theme that there's a direct continuity of material, organic continuity, the actual living thing itself, linking the tree of life from the Garden of Eden to the cross, sometimes also to Noah's Ark, to other things, besides to very sacred woods and trees that are planted in medieval England, for that matter. that we see pop up again from time to time.
Yeah, I mean, even Christ is referred to as the shoot from the stump of Jesse,
Mm-hmm.
right? So there's that business. And I was struck just this last Easter when they had the exposition of the cross, and it says, "Behold, behold, the wood of the cross." And we normally just think, "Oh, it's the cross," right? But it's specific in the language. It's
Mm-hmm.
"behold the wood of the cross." That this is what
Right.
Christ ends up being reunited to in a way. Yeah, it's a torture device, it's true, but it's a wooden torture device. It's like this is the tree on which he hang. So behold the wood of the cross on which hangs our salvation. It's an interesting thing
Right.
that somehow human beings are intimately connected to trees and to life and to
Right. And the
nature.
divinity is intimately connected to
Divinity is, yeah.
trees, right? You've now taken the non-fashion, so various idols carved out of wood, as well as stone and gold and other things. There are various sacred trees among different nations have trees that are sacred to them, that are gods of some
Right,
sort or another.
right.
And you've got Hashem, who's not able to be depicted, all of a sudden becoming incarnate, becoming a man, and now is able to be depicted because he's in fact depicted himself. So it's in the fact that he has a human body is able to be depicted. So that's why all of a sudden Christians have iconography of God, have images of God, which previously had been forbidden. But similarly, you've got the tree gods, the sacred tree, the idea of the sacred tree, or drawing directly from Nordic mythology, you've got the world tree, like the cosmos as a tree, being now united to the undepictable God, the God who you cannot depict in imagery, the two of them being united together. So what had been, some would say, a false idol of the nations, a false God of the nations, you've got now in Christ being nailed to the cross, an image of the unification of these two elements, which is again the drawing up from the things from below to the things from above, right? A tree grows up from the earth towards the heavens, and you've got the heavens coming down to subsume, to intermingle with the tree that comes up from the earth. So a tree then also, in some ways, I suppose you could say, the Nordics are justified. There's something intrinsically supernatural or divine about a tree in that it's at least it aspires to the heavens.
Yeah,
It reaches up
yeah,
to
yeah,
go towards
right.
the heavens. And
Yeah.
in Christ, then the heavens come down, and he literally gets united to a cross. He gets nailed to it, and his blood mingles with it, which, of course, we have in the beautiful poem, the Anglo-Saxon poem, The Dream of the Rood, which rood literally means rod or staff, which is also what the Greeks call it. They don't call a cross a cross. So in
Okay.
Latin, we're fixated on the notion of two beams and perpendicular to each other. And so that's where we get the idea of cross, is cruciform, is that these things are in crossing each other, two beams at 90-degree angle. For the Greek and for the Anglo-Saxon, they're fixated on the fact that it's a stick of wood. That's what's significant about it. So stavros is the word in Greek, or rod in often pronounced rude, modern day reinterpretations of Old English, but a rod or a stavros. So we're fixated on the fact that it's a pillar of wood.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's another interesting insight too. Uh, how does time begin with the reunification of Christ and the tree, Christ and the cross? It's an interesting little thought there, because of course in this story, time begins with this gentle transfer from one light to another between the two trees. In Christianity, in a way, time begins with Christ on the cross with two trees on either side, right? The two.
That's right, because you've got two other
Yeah,
staves, two other trees. So the tree of life there, and you've got two others beside it. Yeah, that's an interesting image.
there's a poem of the Journey of the Magi by T.S. Eliot, I think it's called,
Hmm.
and he indicates in there that when these three Magi visit Christ, they have a vision of what's going to happen with him, and
Mm-hmm.
he says back in his wealthy, posh palace, he says, "I would be glad for another death. I'd be glad for something to happen that would change this permanent world of just luxury and just indolence, and something that would change all this." Of course, he's hinting that time would begin at the moment of crucifixion and then the resurrection.
Which is an interesting thing, because there are peoples in places that, of course, reckon the beginning of the year from Good Friday, from Easter, from the
Right, exactly.
crucifixion or the resurrection.
April. Yeah,
Right.
I mean, that's why we get April Fools, right?
And so
That's that April Fool thing comes from that. So, people that used to abide by the old calendar and not the new calendar were called fools, as a put down, as a pejorative. Switching
right, because the imposition of the Gregorian calendar starting in January.
Yep.
Yeah.
They were seen as fools, but they were the adherents to the old way of doing things, the ancient way of doing things, which is that you celebrate the new year when the new life comes into being.
Right.
Time begins with the new life, not in the middle of the freezing cold and abysmal winter when you're in the underworld. Wow.
Right.
Thus began the days of the bliss of Valinor. What's being got at there, do you think? Days of the bliss of Valinor.
You know, because we just read about the end of the spring of Arda, which is the whole earth. But the bliss of Valinor, that's different. I think, so Valinor, henceforward, becomes a destination. It becomes it's the abode of the gods, not just, how to say, this is the place towards which everything is oriented, right?
Yeah.
Or occidented, I guess, because it's in the west, but everything is pointing towards it. Like, that's where you go, right? That's what it means to go up towards the heavens, right? Is to go to the west in Tolkien's world, in the world of Middle Earth. And so it's like the light became a sort of consecrating water that hallowed Valinor.
Yeah.
That makes it the place of bliss, of and what does the word bliss mean? It's beatitude, right? This is an Old English word for what we call beatitude now, for blessedness, bliss, bless, beatify. These are all the same. They come from the same root. Where bliss comes from bless, and they're the same difference. The idea of it's blessed. It is now a blessed realm.
Blessed realm.
And it's sacred. It's set apart from the other parts, from the other places of Arda. And it is from the earth, right? It's set apart, it's consecrated, it's hallowed now by the light of these trees. It's the trees that then make it holy.
Yeah, they make it almost like,
really
like the description I was thinking is sort of like how people describe areas like Northern California or whatever. You know, Northern California looks like this. You know, the light that was spilled from the trees endured long ere it was taken up into the airs or sank down into the earth. And the dews of Telperion and the rain that fell from Lada and Varda, hoarded in great vats like shining lakes that were to all the land of the Valar as wells of water and of light. You know, it's kind of like, that's like Northern California. But I suppose you could also look at it, you know, it's like any, you know, you go out to the boundary waters. It's kind of like that, you know, minus the mosquitoes, but it's kind of like that. Right. It's that time.
Like Como in northern Italy.
Yeah, right, exactly. It's just kind of time of bliss and a kind of calm and beauty, and everything's right with the world. And you don't have to worry about who's getting elected, and you don't have to worry about what the doctors are telling you to put over your face. You don't have to worry about this, that, or the other thing. It's just calm, and you're out on the lake, and the sun's rising, and that's the bliss. Yeah.
And here's an interesting thing, is that this image of liquid light it touches on a very common experience of anyone who has been to Ravenna and seen, for instance, the Mausoleum of Galla Placidia or the mosaics of San Vitale, is that to be so surrounded by, and this is what's beautiful about the Mausoleum of Galla Placidia, is this ancient, was it 4th, 5th or 6th century mausoleum, which is covered to the last millimeter, covered in these glass tesserae mosaics of just brilliant colors, principally blue. And when you step into there, it's like being surrounded with liquid light of many colors, because especially when you realize the sort of physical, chemical, or scientific composition of what glass is essentially a liquid in very slow suspension, is that you literally are surrounded at least by liquid sand, or liquid minerals, liquid silicon. That's what glass is, a liquid that's capturing the light, because that's what glass does with, you're right. So these mosaic tiles that the Christians really invent. Mosaics exist in ancient Greece and ancient Rome, but they're marble, or they're travertine, or they're flat, they're opaque, and they're non-luminescent. Christianity, with this theology of light, that Christ is the light has come into the world, so we illuminate our temples so that the walls themselves become luminous. And the ancient temples of the Christians were, when we move beyond, not beyond, but we shift from simply frescoes to installing mosaics. We don't install flat, opaque matte mosaics. We install luminescent mosaics. That is glass with a layer of, say, gold leaf in between, or different colored metals that then reflect, or that we tint the glass itself to then capture, absorb, and reflect the light, so that when you light lights, especially in the right places, the walls themselves appear to be luminescent. So you become surrounded by liquid light. And so that's, I think, this is profound theological symbolism in this, that it really is the light of Iluvatar then, made liquid, makes it transportable, makes it now all of a sudden it's able to touch things, bless things, hallow things, and so on. Christians line the inside of of our temples with it. I think really profound imagery to meditate on is light as liquid, which means it's bathing you at all times.
Yeah, right. And that is a state of blessedness, of bliss, of happiness, calm happiness, set apart from the chaos, of the world around you. And in that state, one can say, yeah, you could remain for some time. It is the perfect state into which you can introduce these new things that are going to emerge here, these elves, or you could say these new things, these thoughts, whatever, they're making decisions, while you're sitting there in the chapel. But it is also interesting to me that it is a place from which you have to go out back into the world. You can't stay there forever. Just like the story can't stay there forever. I mean, if nothing happened after this, this is the end of the Silmarillion, right?
Right. We've told the story of light. That's all that needs to be said.
We're done. The Cologne Cathedral's finished.
Right. But what do we see now with this alternance of light, with being bathed in liquid light? The Valar begin to turn their minds to, hey, we've got some business we have to be about.
Yeah.
The rest of the world is a barren wasteland.
Right.
And hypothetically, the elves and men might not come into being in Valinor. They might come into being out there, and we better go tend to that garden. And that is, I think, what we should discuss next episode.
I think so too. Good. Well, I thank you very much. This has been a good conversation. I really appreciate it. So, Dr. Thompson, farewell. Wherever you fare, to your areas receive you at the journey's end.
And may the wind under your wings bear you to where the sun sails and the moon walks, to be bathed in liquid light.
Bathed in liquid light, yes, indeed. So long.